So with that, I am super stoked to bring in our first set of guests for this question that certainly is something that I think about constantly as a Washington, D.C. policy nerd, that we all are going to be thinking about in different configurations, this big, broad question of what should be our federal policy agenda. So let me welcome in Clay Lord from Americans for the Arts, Carson Elrod from Be an Arts Hero, Tom Chauncey from Partisan Arts and NITO, and Gene Cook, our musician, who's a professional musician and activist who is involved in Musicians Worker Alliance. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. I want to start just to give some framing. Just ask you all to briefly introduce yourselves, talk a tiny bit about your organization and sort of the role that you're playing in today's conversation. So everybody's playing a little bit of a different role in terms of what hat you wear in terms of the work that you do. And Clay, let me start with you if you don't mind. You want to say hi?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Clay Lord. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Impact at Americans for the Arts. Americans for the Arts is a 60-year-old national nonprofit that focuses on advocacy and policy, as well as localized education and sort of transformation of the creative sector. Our overarching goal is to make sure that everyone has access to a full and vibrant creative life. And we do that by encouraging policy solutions and creating research that helps people understand how arts and culture is essential to the creation of healthy, vibrant, and equitable communities. I'm here today as a representative of a sort of larger group of people at Americans for the Arts, as well as a consortium called the Getting Creative Workers to Work Coalition that has created something called the Put Creative Workers to Work policy suggestions. And I'll talk more about that when time comes. Otherwise, I would ramble on for the whole time. So there you go.
Clay. Thank you. Tom Chauncey.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm Tom Chauncey. I'm on the executive board of NITO, which is the National Independent Talent Organization. We are comprised of approximately 100 or so independent talent agencies and about 120 management companies. We're new to advocacy. It began in mid-March, early April. We came together as a body when we realized that there was basically no trade organization that represented our voice. We initially thought we'd begin our conversation inside of NIVA. Most of you probably are familiar with NIVA, the National Independent Venue Association. Became apparent that they're on their track and we're on ours. We share similar goals. We wanted to have and needed to have our own voice in the conversation, so we started our own organization. So our advocacy, I'm probably the freshest face in the advocacy conversation, and I'm happy to be here and happy to tell you a little bit about what we're struggling to try and do, for our members and for the larger music industry.
Awesome. Gene Cook.
Hi, my name is Gene Cook, and I use the she, they pronouns. I'm a musician. I was with Future of Music Coalition for many years with Michael Bracy. And over the last 2 years, I've been working with a group of musicians and DJs, mostly in the New York area, to think about ways that we can support musicians, both in terms of social safety net issues, but also in terms of economic justice issues in relation to the large corporations that have an outsized influence in the music ecosystem. Starting in March, our work scaled in an unexpected way, and we expanded the footprint of our work to go nationally simply because of the online nature of information sharing and also the urgent need for mutual aid and mutual support. So we've gotten very involved beyond just what we had previously been doing, kind of working on gig worker legislation in New York State and working on a city level on different kinds of legislation that's meant to support freelancers, including artists, to partnering with folks like Be an Arts Hero and Extend PUA and folks that are out there and have come together so quickly and urgently to try and extend benefits, unemployment benefits, the pandemic benefit, to bring that back. That expired at the end of July. And also think about how we rebuild once we start to rebuild, what that looks like, how we do it equitably, and how we do it in a way that we feel like we're supporting artists and centering artists in those spaces. Thank you for having me.
Carson.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carson Elrod. He, his. I'm from BN Arts Hero. Like so many other people on this panel, really the moment makes the movement. And that's what's happening in the country right now. And it's not just in the art space. It's in so many other spaces where the United States economy is collapsing and cratering, and everyday people are standing up for themselves. So right now it's estimated that there's 2.7 million completely unemployed arts workers. I am one of them. I lost 3 jobs in March and have not had one since. And that is the story of so many people in our industry. And so as FPUC ended, as I'm looking at the end of my insurance, and so many other people are too, in July, a lot of us felt like we got pushed out the side of a skyscraper, and the option is just to fall and hit the ground, or try to build a rocket ship in the air. And that's what we've been doing. And so we have been hustling and bustling ourselves, organizing, talking to every organization, every advocate, anyone who will meet with us. And we're trying to get rank and file arts workers, all 5.1 million of us. And so right now we have an organization that continues to expand and grow. And the conversations that we have are with people in the touring space, in the music space, in the not-for-profit space, in the for-profit space. And we don't stop. We Zoom about 12 hours a day, and we just expand our coalition. We have about 100 people working with us, all of them unemployed arts workers who are experts in their field, expert PR people, expert press people, expert social media managers. The other day we were looking around and we were like, we're running a multi-million-dollar company for free because this is just a bunch of really super talented, desperate people coming together to try to make something happen. So that is kind of the summation of who Be an Arts Hero is, and we'll talk more about our objectives, etc. But like more than anything, we're existing to join the chorus that the logjam be unjammed and immediate relief come to our sector to protect the human and physical infrastructure of the creative economy.
Thank you all for those introductory remarks. And I want to, sort of try to frame the conversation a little bit around a couple of ideas. And I first want to be really clear that it's very easy to backseat drive in advocacy. Advocacy is really hard work. Getting things through Washington, navigating Washington, especially as under-resourced organizations. This town, as everybody knows, is very much controlled by corporate power. At this point, the policy apparatuses are really sort of hard to navigate if you don't have massive resources and infrastructure behind it. It requires a significant level of technical expertise and legal expertise. There are a lot of challenges. And so what I'm about to say is not meant to be taking shots at anybody who's been doing this work for a long time. It's just meant to sort of, again, frame some of the moment that I think that we're in. And that is, for way too long, we've sort of looked at our community is really kind of been incredibly incremental as we think about policy. We think about what is the role of government and where do we fit into that, and what do we ask for, and what can we get. The idea that a 5% increase or decrease in NEA funding is some sort of proxy for cultural policy is just wrong, and we love the NEA and they're critical. The level of federal investment engagement in the arts and culture sector is woefully short and small. And, I think it's not inconsistent to be very appreciative of all the work that went for years into the passage of the Music Modernization Act, recently, and appreciate the very tangible benefits that that's going to give to a lot of members of the music community. but also recognize that when you think about the sort of structures that we're dealing with, and not only the crisis of today's moment, but again, pre-COVID, post-COVID, I think to Gene's point, we've kind of been kidding around a little bit over the last day and a half about, the sort of trite nature of the president-elect's slogan of build back better, but that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about how do we do these things better? How do we question the sort of assumptions of where we've been for a long time? And how do we sort of collectively raise our game, in an environment where we have this remarkable flowering of advocacy groups of people who are really, rising to this challenge. So I'm going to just share a slide because I like to share slides, even though it ain't too pretty. But I want to just kind of share this idea to frame our conversation. So we're talking about developing a federal agenda. It's possible, and again, this is a gross simplification, but just to get our head around it a little bit, really, you're talking about three different components, and some of them are more public and visible than others. The first is clearly legislation and direct advocacy. We're going to be talking about that in a few minutes, but obviously something like Save Our Stages, a piece of legislation that people are rallying around. They're getting co-sponsors. They're trying to pass the bill. Then you get into the different world or the related world of regulations and rulemakings, which, in the context of today's conversation, or things like net neutrality, which is going to be back at the FCC for the sixth go around, or something that we talked about yesterday, which is really exciting, which is the potential of going to OMB and trying to change NICS codes, try to, revisit how we do data collection at the federal level to potentially help us unlock our understanding of our cultural ecosystems. And then the third is again, something that I would argue is not as well appreciated, understood as it potentially could be, and something that hopefully we'll see a lot of work on over the next number of years, which is just the ongoing policy engagement and dialogue, and the understanding that there are people inside government that understand that music aligns with things that they're trying to accomplish on a policy level, and that they are eager to sort of have these relationships and talk to members of the community so they understand where music aligns with things they're trying to do around public health, around housing, urban development, around criminal justice, around all the different pieces. And so we're, again, in our session later today, talking about who's going to be in the Biden administration and what does that look like is going to, we're going to kind of unpack some of that in that session. But the ability to just basically be in the dialogue and be in the game and then understand how you can be a resource for them is a big part of the overall, sort of federal agency. So with that as a frame, why don't we just kind of throw it out there, and maybe why don't we just start with the lowest hanging, easiest to understand, lowest hanging fruit, kind of the Save Our Stages piece. If anybody, wants to speak to Save Our Stages, your sense of where that is, sort of the import of that legislation, what people are doing around it. Does anybody want
Michael,
to
before you do that, can I just suggest that there's a fourth thing in that list of three that I think is actually really important to some of what you said as the frame, which is a question of communication and value that goes way beyond sort of policy objectives, but I think is really important. It's certainly not the type of granular stuff that I think we'll spend a lot of time talking about right now, but there's a reason that we have such a relatively unhealthy investment from the federal government in arts and culture in the United States. And it is only partially due to the nature of the efforts and the players involved in whatever, because there have been a lot of people trying really hard for a long time to get where we are. And yes, absolutely, that's not where we should be. But I think it's important to recognize that anything that we're talking about right now, for it to have a chance of success, needs to sit inside a specific framework of what Americans and American decision makers think is valuable about arts and culture, whether that's right or wrong, whether that's what we want it to be or not. It's really important to think about that. And I do think there's a difference between what they think about right now in the context of disaster relief and recovery, where I think they have a slightly wider and sort of more permeable understanding of that. And it's where we can see things like getting support for something like Save Our Stages, which is a relatively gigantic amount of money for anything that's ever happened to arts and culture in federal policy in the history of the government, versus the sort of longer term, long before this, all the way back to, the founding of the modern United States. And I think probably once this window closes going forward, this sort of inflexible understanding of culture as something that has to be tied to the practicalities of the way the country works. So I just want to put that in as context as well, and acknowledge that you're right that we can put a desire for more alongside a celebration of all the effort that's gone in, but it's really important that those two things be together, because there has been significant effort. It was a significant effort just to make the NEA happen. It took 75 years to get the NEA into existence. So, you know, want to put that out there as well.
No, I think that's great. I think that's great. I'm just going to stop talking. You guys talk. Go. I've been talking too much.
Well, I feel like I totally agree that how you communicate things is incredibly important, and that this year with things like Save Our Stages, which is so much more specific and so much more direct than the broader idea of an NEA, we see an opportunity to raise the level of sophistication with which policymakers are thinking about the arts and culture industries. Like what Americans for the Arts and many others were so successful in doing, in defining arts and culture as not being just about nonprofits, right? Or not just being about nonprofits and for-profits, but also about workers. When I think about Be an Arts Hero and the Dawn Act and the idea of like, well, let's think about the workers. And then you have others who are like, well, let's think about the large corporations that have access to venture capital. And then there are others who are like, let's think about those that are about to die and they're really central to their communities. And so in this moment, when I think about how the literacy of policymakers has gone up, you know, how do you support that and how do you kind of continue that? Two things that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned today are just kind of about what's the difference between an artist and an arts worker, right? Is there a difference? What does that look like? And then another major question is just kind of like, if you fund the NEA, does that help artists? Or, you know, like when you think about the big major mechanisms that they're using to push out the relief money, you know, how does that work? And so the two things, so on those two things, the first is what's also amazing about this moment is that because everybody's in a panic and they're trying to figure out what's going on, they're asking their membership all kinds of questions that they haven't asked before. So there's new data and new information that's out there that helps us to understand our field and advocate for our field more effectively than we ever have been able to before. So something that I recently learned, which I didn't know, and this is, of course, you know, based on, these aren't like fancy studies, these are just kind of like out there trying to get what information is out there, but that artists are 3 times more likely to be gig workers compared to the general kind of performing arts community member, and then 2 times more likely to be unemployed right now. Super interesting, right? It gives a little bit of grain and definition so people can understand, well, are they taken care of or are they not taken care of with this proposed legislation? The second thing regarding the NEA, and, you know, it's really hard to figure out what's going to help arts workers. I think that after looking at all of the different relief mechanisms, that unemployment ultimately has been the most successful, both in terms of, you know, being able to get rolled out kind of all over, but then also in terms of adoption. When I think about like things like the NEA, they distribute money to the states, and then through the states, they distribute money through councils. And often it's like there's a hope. There's a hope that it's going to trickle down and that the artists are going to be able to benefit from the money that flows. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like unemployment is such an important thing to focus on, and not just making sure that you're able to extend the pandemic benefit and also just extend just unemployment in general for those who have been surviving off of it and will likely have to survive off of it for another year. But also thinking about how do our systems actually work for these workers, right? So you have a number of people who are applying for unemployment who are getting denied, or they're getting less than they should be getting because they're a mix of 1099 and W-2 worker. And, you know, what's so great about including arts workers in all of this CARES legislation, and when you're thinking about kind of like how unemployment is supposed to work, that they're supposed to be getting access to these things, it gives us an opportunity to see how these structures, I mean, kind of getting to the second bucket of what Michael's saying, right? It's not just about the laws, it's also about the regulations and how the laws are implemented. Like seeing where the pain points are. and what needs to be fixed at this point. And it's super clear that as we think about 2021, there's a huge opportunity, lots of information, lots of learning to think about how to reform unemployment and to really fix the mixed income issue, for example, or for people who travel from state to state and have income from many different states. Like, how do you make sure that that works well? And then one last thing, sorry, I just thought about it, is like the concept of, if you want to center the artists in this conversation, think a little bit about like a relief return on investment, right? So like, how much time is an artist putting in to be able to actually receive relief? And if you look at all of the things that are out there, you know, like pandemic unemployment, you look at like all the different relief funds that are out there, you look at like rent abatement, you look at the food programs, and you look at PPP. We have a survey that we're running right now to better understand the nuances of how artists are navigating those pieces and what's most useful and what's less useful. If you have like, even just like a simple like ratio, people who applied who didn't get it compared to people who applied who got it. And if you were to take all the different relief options available to artists and put them in order of what was hardest to easiest, like pandemic unemployment is absolutely the easiest. Like, we've looked at the numbers, the preliminary numbers coming through. Unemployment is the next easiest. And then you kind of go on, and then kind of further down is like music cares and PPP, and then like artist relief and those kinds of funds are so well known, but like so oversubscribed. And so, you know, 3 times as many people are applying from the community that we're seeing than are actually getting it. So just thinking about like, where can you insert the concept of kind of relief return on investment when you're building infrastructure and when you're trying to support artists. We had the first wave, the big first wave of relief that happened in March and April, and that, you know, nothing really has come through since then, and we're still waiting for what the second big wave is going to be. And so my big hope is that as they think about the second wave, that they'll also be thinking about not just making opportunities available, but supporting artists to be able to take advantage of those. And I've just said so much, so I'm just going to pause.
Jean, that was all awesome. Thank you for all of that. I'd love to talk just like on a more macro level about what Save Our Stages represents. Rather than the legislation itself or what it does. What it represents is a community in crisis that came together and was able to actually craft a piece of legislation that now has like a lot of sponsorship by policymakers. And so the idea that there are more people in the conversation now inserting themselves into the conversation because of desperation, because of need, because of the fact that 90% of music venues are slated to evaporate from the fabric of our reality without direct assistance, and that crisis and that need inspired people to come together to form a new organization, to put legislation out there to be able to successfully get bipartisan introduction. Whether it's successful or not, and I hope that it is, what it represents is it represents a new moment, and that's the moment that we are in. We are in a moment where more people in this space, who live in this space, who need this space for their livelihoods, are becoming a more active participant in the policy that directly affects their lives. And so on the big level, everything that Jean said is absolutely right. The most important thing for the 2.7 million people right now in our community that are suffering are these kind of big macro programs that help the entire hurting American family. But on a micro level, it's really hopeful, I think, inspiring, that in a moment of crisis there is also opportunity, and the opportunity is to like look around for common cause, and the opportunity is to look around for how to join together, how to have a new relationship to policy, a new relationship to legislation, a new relationship to advocacy, and actually try to get things done. So when I look at Save Our Stages, I look at it in from that rubric, and so I'm hopeful that it will be the first of many pieces of legislation that come together by a newer or a bigger and more coalesced sector-wide effort to change the conversation about how legislative bodies understand the creative economy and their socioeconomic value. So that's kind of macro thought about Save Our Stages.
I'll jump in, I guess. I've got the maybe more cynical sort of observation, if you will, and I think that Michael, one of the questions you were bringing up is that we could talk about is where we're going and what the future is going to look like. And I think in order to understand what the future is going to look like, we have to understand sort of the minefield that we're in right now, and the likelihood of where we think our industry is going to definitely change in the next 12 months. And so the only way we're going to be able to talk about the future is to try and save the present as a starting point. Save our stages, from my experience, and this is what sort of is maybe the most disheartening thing to me personally, because I got in the music business because I like music. It inspires me. Yes, I didn't mention, but I run a talent agency, and so the artists I work with inspire me. I support them because I believe in what they talk about, and that's kind of my mission, is to try and promote, build an ability for them to have a place to work from. And so I come at it from a sort of a cultural point of view. What's been the most disturbing, disappointing thing to me is to sort of see how little importance politicians seem to put on culture in that conversation. I've had the privilege of having a lot of Zoom conversations with a lot of Senate staffs and congressional staff, chief of staffs, and in certain cases some Congress people. And frankly, the reason why Save Our Stages exists is because of the economic conversation. All we've done is we've spent time educating Congress about how many people are in this space. Congress thinks that everybody is the Rolling Stones and U2. Everybody's a superstar. And they don't realize there's millions of people that, I think the statistic I've seen is, the average musician makes $25,000 a year. Well, that's not really even a livable wage for most people in most parts of the country. And that's not even talking about the people behind the stage, right? Who are all struggling to support that person who's making $25,000 a year on average. So Save Our Stages came together because of the economic conversation, pointing out what the economic impact is of each of these small venues on that small town on Main Street. The restaurant, the bar, the hotel, the Uber drivers, the babysitters who, the flights people, hotels people are spending to come in to see concerts. So that's ultimately, I think, the way it has come together. And the NEA is fantastic, but I think a very small percentage of artists benefit from the NEA. And that's not to disparage the NEA. I think what they do is incredible. I wish they had better funding. But I think if we're talking about artists and how they work and the circumstances in which they work, again, very few are working within NEA support. So Save Our Stages, getting back to that for a second, really is that needs to pass, because it's going to deliver support for those venues that are the sort of launch pads and the starting point for most artists. So,
I think it's important to recognize both the frustration and also the reality of the economics that are behind Save Our Stages, and just to say out loud that in the United States, we unfortunately don't have the same luxury of sort of common understanding of the value of culture, independent of what it does for people on an economic or some other social level. And I think Save Our Stages is certainly not, hopefully, the end, but is a really interesting beginning, in that it is allowing people to understand, and particularly allowing legislators to understand, the full breadth and scope, at least to some degree, of the creative economy. I think one of the other things that we have struggled from in the past is this bifurcation and sort of distribution of what is the total creative economy, which is $878 billion and 5.1 million people, and larger than tourism and larger than construction, and all of these great things that we can talk about because of the BEA and the numbers they've generated for us. But I think that the next step, and what Carson, I think you were talking about, is that the crisis has inspired a necessary coalescing of the fullness of the creative economy, at least in part because otherwise people won't listen to us. And I think that's actually a really good thing. It's the opportunity to come out of the crisis, is that we can actually start to speak as a relatively full spectrum. The Putting Creative Workers to Work document has 2,200 signatories, and they range from the largest and the largest nonprofits, the largest for-profits, all the way down to mom and pop shops, to individuals, both famous and not famous. I know that Carson, Be an Arts Hero, has a similar letter that has like 16,000 people who've signed it. I think there is something that I hope is something we can sustain, that has to do with showing the might of the creative economy in the language that decision makers need to hear. So if that's economic might, great. If it is the number of voters we have, great. If it's the fact that our people vote at a higher rate than the general population, great. And if that's what gets us to recovery funds that are more in line with what the sector deserves, then that's a good first step. What I'm also interested in, and I think this is to Jean's point, is that this is a moment to try and address systemic things that have existed, and if they don't change, all this recovery funding is going to be great, but we're still going to have people making $25,000 a year or less. And so until we can figure out a way to get government to allow independent workers to have permanent access to unemployment, until we can figure out as a field how to give people fair wages, and to understand that we can't talk out of both sides of our mouth about wanting to be at the table, but then treating people to something less than they deserve in their wages, we're not actually going to get to a creative economy that is better for people post-pandemic. And so my hope is that we can figure out how to do both of those things in this moment of crisis, both through legislation and then also through the adaptation of current regulations, through the work in the field to kind of recognize the challenges we have and try and make them better. And also through the creation of these vast coalitions that are coming together, which are so incredible, and that hopefully, coalitions are hard. Coalitions are really hard to sustain, and they're particularly hard to sustain when you're not in crisis anymore. So I'm really interested to see what happens once we get whatever, or once we have a vaccine, or once we get $10 billion that go into the hole that is $50 to $60 billion in losses for this industry, at least. So that's where my energy comes from in this, is to try and see those opportunities that are there, while also recognizing that they have to function inside the pragmatics and reality of what it is to be in the United States right now.
Yeah, well, Clay, I mean, maybe you've articulated essentially what I'm trying to say, so thank you. And if I had to sum up, my point is, I think the conversation has strength when you approach it from an economic direction. And when you do that, then you have the doors cracked open, so you can start to insert and talk about the value of what culture represents and what brings, and that's even a harder educational path for legislators, in my opinion, based on my conversations, which have been super small. And again, I just started this, but that's the challenge, trying to explain what joy and happiness artists can bring, and how culture, how music shapes culture. I come at it from a music point of view, but again, I think the economic argument is one that works, and then you can insert the cultural one alongside it, and hopefully then build off of that. But we got to get to the other side of this crisis. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to understand what foundation we even have to work with.
No, I think, and Tom, I think that, I agree with, I think, everything that everybody's said so far in this conversation. I would just add a couple points on top of that. I think, the first is, and we spoke on this yesterday in some of our sessions, again, part of what was the, really, I think, smart strategy during the Obama era NEA was recognizing that ultimately the power of the NEA is not their grant making or their sort of internal staffing and resources, but is their ability to basically put the arts and culture conversation into every aspect of governance. To really understand what is the health implications of music, what is the education implications of music, what is the HUD implications of music. And we're going to get back to that in the next administration. And we're going to get back to it, though, 10 years after this was happening before, with a lot more infrastructure, a lot more research, a lot more enthusiasm on the ground, so we don't just have to go through the economic lens, which you're exactly right. That's been the way people have tried to crack this and have been working on it. But we can really be thinking about, again, I told the story yesterday about, being with Jamie Duffy from Youth on Record, getting an award when she got an award, when Youth on Record got an award from James Comey 2 weeks before he got fired at the FBI, because the FBI understood Youth on Record fundamentally as youth engagement strategy, right? So we're going to be able to think, more holistically, hopefully. The other piece again is, and this is why I'm excited that we have our keynote interview with Barry Lynn. We've accepted the structures of the industry, for 20 years that have basically come out of a complete dereliction of duty for the federal government willing to engage in antitrust. So whether you look at the structures of the live music industry, whether you look at platform dominations, you look at all the things that we just sort of accept as by fiat that we're trying to work around, we need to have a fundamentally different conversation about what antitrust looks like and where our sector fits into that conversation and what we can do to resource that conversation in a way that, frankly, we did not have the infrastructure. When I was at the table with like 5 others around Live Nation Ticketmaster, like we didn't have the data and infrastructure necessary to really work with the Justice Department to kind of sort this stuff out. So it's going to be super, interesting, and to think about, again, beyond sort of the more sort of traditional advocacy structures that we're engaging in the economic arguments, also the ability to kind of worm around different, kind of conversations with different agencies and what that could look like. So it's going to be interesting. This is, we've got about 5 minutes. And so I'm sorry, because there's so much we could be talking about. This could be the entire conference. Certainly.
So can I throw in that? So Julie Baker has asked, Julie Baker's raised the specter of AB5 in California, which I think is an interesting illustration of some of the conversation we're having today, because AB5 is a bill that was passed that basically makes it harder to classify people as independent contractors, it was aimed at groups like Uber and Lyft, which now have managed to get themselves excluded from it because they spent $200 million getting a proposition passed in the last election that excludes them. But it's hard because it has had a sort of unintended consequence of forcing a lot of small and a lot of cultural organizations of all sizes to move what were independent contractors into employment status, which comes with like a 30% bump in cost per person. So the question was basically, what should we do about that? And the background on that is that cultural organizations were really unhappy and were really vocally unhappy about AB5 and ended up on what I would argue is sort of the wrong side of history for reasons that had to do with the kind of future survival of the sector. Because it ended up that they were coming out against, it looked like they were coming out against fair wages for creative workers because they couldn't afford it, and access to insurance for creative workers because they couldn't afford it. So I think that that's where some of the conversation that we're in kind of needs to go, is that we as a sector have been chronically under-resourced. That chronic under-resourcing passes on to the people who are part of our sector, including creative workers. We don't have necessarily the policies in place or the safety net to allow the creative sector to run like creative sectors run in other countries. So for example, there is no universal health insurance, which means that you can't assume that everyone has health insurance as they can in certain European countries. It means that you can't access unemployment as an individual creative most of the time, which means you can't assume that people can go from job to job on sort of minimal wages. So it's a really thorny problem. Where we are in terms of that thinking is that ideally there needs to be some sort of runway that allows the creative sector to catch up with the spirit of the law, rather than the creative sector, and that creative sector should ideally be advocating for that rather than advocating against the classification of people that would allow them to make a living wage. But it's really, really thorny. So I just wanted to answer that from the comments and throw it out to folks.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, and I feel like this is a real opportunity for the arts and cultural sector, right? So previously, the advocacy agenda for arts and culture had been quite limited, and this year has forced them to kind of start to think about, well, what are the issues that we're experiencing that people outside of the arts and culture sector are also experiencing? And the AB5 legislation is about a big picture conversation about what does it mean to work with dignity in the United States and who's responsible for ensuring that our social safety net works. Is it individual organizations? Is it the government? And that ultimately the question is the arts sector going to get to a place where they're able to engage in the larger conversation? I totally agree. Or are they going to get stuck on, oh, well, this is impacting us in this way, let's push that out? I think right now, like we should be talking to NELP. We should be talking to the Poor People's Campaign, that platform and agenda that's come out that's talking about not just about the need for a stronger social safety net, but just a more integrated society in general that values everybody, regardless of kind of where they come from or how they've come into the United States and into the society. But I know we're kind of close to the end of time, so
we are, yeah.
Just pause there.
So we obviously, these are way too big ideas to try to put into a 40-minute session. So I apologize both for our speakers and for the audience, because we could really take this a long time. But I would like to suggest a couple sort of takeaways. I mean, the first is, again, as someone who's been doing this work for 20 some odd years, this is in many ways the most exciting moment around these advocacy conversations that we've ever seen. I mean, we've got enormous need. We have a crisis, an unprecedented crisis. We also have more infrastructure and engagement and opportunity to, again, do the types of structural reforms that all of us have been working on, many of us have been working on for a long time. And the hope is, and again, we didn't even talk about the dynamics of Congress. In fact, we don't know who's going to control the Senate until we get past the July 5th runoffs. I mean, there are a lot of complexities in terms of developing an agenda. The hope would be a couple of things. One is that people who participate in this conference will feel some alignment with either the speakers that you heard today or other organizations that are doing this really detailed, hard, intentional, and strategic work to figure out how, again, we can have, the old cliches, control what you can control, and that there's some sort of connectivity in terms of what are you trying to accomplish and how does that get played out in terms of policy. So hopefully everybody is either part of an organizational network, can find a network that represents them or that they feel alignment with, can volunteer, can do the things that we need to do to kind of get these things over the hump. And I think the other thing I just would really like to hold up, which I think is extraordinarily exciting, is the sense of, partnership and alignment and collaboration, that, this is not a zero-sum game. And the problem with music advocacy over the years is that it has been perceived as a zero-sum game. And if one group does well, the other group does poorly, and that you can't get anything done because everybody's just sort of going at each other. And the fact that I think all these organizations and networks fundamentally have shared vision, have shared values, are looking to be collaborative. There's so much that needs to be unpacked here. Again, I appreciate everybody, the presenters, putting some contact information and resources in the chat to get a better sense of what the organizations are and these proposals and concepts. Again, during the lunchtime, we'll do just a sort of a breakout with anybody who's interested, and just continue to kind of chop this stuff up for a while. And we're excited and we're looking forward to where this stuff is going. So Tom, Jean, Clay, Carson, thank you so much for joining us and being part of an impossible effort to try to distill this in 40 minutes. But thanks for all of your work and for being with us. And we're excited moving forward.